Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, yWhales, wherever in the world you are today. So today is February 7th, 2023. Bitcoin is doing its little $23,000 dance. And while we're still clearly in a bear market, I think that it's great that we've come up from the teens of Bitcoin. You know, we're up into the 20s, but we're far from a bull. We're into a healthier market, but we still have a long way to go. And the reason why I always want to preface by where the cryptocurrency market is, not because we're talking about a cryptocurrency today, but it really does set the stage for innovation and really investment in the space. And one of the things that's so important is that there's always continued innovation and developers that are constantly working in the space to attract the next generation of entrepreneurs, to attract the next generation of the degens that don't even know about this asset class today, but they need to, they want to. This is going to solve their problems. And so I'm really excited to talk to Brennan from Kwil, because what you guys are doing today is closing that learning gap and making it so much easier for so many people around the world that when they get interested in this asset class, like they have resources, they have knowledge, and they have systems that look somewhat similar to something they've seen before versus coming in and going, oh my God, do I have to start from scratch? Like, I've read the Satoshi white paper. Where do I go from here? And so real quick, Brennan, before we dive into Kwil, let's start with kind of like what problem you were originally trying to solve, and how you got into this asset class.
Yeah, absolutely. And so first I'd like to start, just thank you so much for having me. But sort of jumping into the problem and how we ended up here, it's definitely actually it's not an atypical story, but it's not a linear path either. So I started during COVID. During COVID, I was at the time studying mechanical engineering in college, and I took a gap year, and I was working like a full-time job. It was an office job. I was doing like some environmental compliance for a general contractor, not really blockchain related at all. It was while I was working here that, so I guess I would spend a lot of my time just developing things on the side that I found interesting, that I found fun. And one day when I was just on my lunch break, I went to Barnes and Noble and I bought a book on Solidity. Like I would just like walk down aisles, and it was usually something programming oriented. And I would just pick something that I thought looked cool, and I would just check it out, try it out. And so it was like December 2020 when the book I chose that day was a book on Solidity. And so I spent probably the next month playing around with Solidity, which for those, if they're not familiar, it's the main language used for writing smart contracts on Ethereum. Mm-hmm. And so I was playing around with that, and I thought it was really interesting. It was just nothing like anything else I had done before. It was very much its own unique thing. And so one of my friends in college, he came from China. He grew up in China, and he had to sort of flee to the U.S. It's like he had to seek political asylum in the U.S. And he had been in the U.S. alone. Like the rest of his family was stuck in China for like 7 years or 8 years. And I talked to him a lot about censorship and the lack of freedom of expression and communication in China. And so I thought that a smart contract, based messaging platform could be a great way to solve for a lot of the issues with censorship, particularly in non-Western countries. And so it started with me first, building this messaging platform, but then we started going down the route of where a lot of the censorship that occurs in these countries and why they can't access, something like Twitter or Facebook, is because of IP blocking and essentially blocking information from being accessed by people in those areas. And so the project further evolved into us trying to build, or it was really just me at the time, but me trying to build a network that was incentivized to serve data and replicate data, so that if you were in a non-Western country where there was censorship, that you could hopefully try to access data from some node that's willing to give it to you. Now, that is an extraordinarily hard problem to solve, and I was certainly not the person to solve it. But it was while building this that I really got integrated into the Web3 ecosystem. I found my way into Arweave, which is a permanent data storage blockchain. And we use that for like our settlement layer for our own network. It didn't take me too long to realize that while, what I wanted to build was, sounded great in theory, it's really hard to build a business on that. And there was actually at one point a VC partner who was like, I really love this idea, but I'm just going to tell you right now, you are not the one to build this. And he was definitely correct. And so that kind of put me in a tough place because I don't like to lose. I don't like to give up. And so all of a sudden I was a solution in search of a problem. I could kind of see that I was not the person to bring this to, non-Western countries. Just as at the time I was 19, I was absolutely not the person who was going to be able to get that done. And so we started looking for other solutions. And so it started with DAOs. So started trying to be like a replacement for Discord, where DAOs could communicate in this permissionless way. But I didn't really understand DAOs. Like most of my time in Web3 had actually been in building the technology. The amount of people I talked to in Web3 was really only in the Arweave ecosystem. And so I honestly was not that familiar with DAOs. But I talked to a lot of DAOs. We talked to I don't even know how many. But there was one DAO we were talking to, and they were building an NFT art gallery, and we were trying to get them to use our social platform for their DAO communication, and they did not seem super interested. But I was talking to them about their product and their NFT art gallery. The entire backend for it was on AWS. And so I was like, oh, why didn't you build this on a data storage platform like Arweave or Filecoin or something? And they said it's because we can't store and query the data that our platform needs. They couldn't store, user relationships for following each other, and then they couldn't go and get how many, likes a certain NFT had, or they couldn't go and get like a curated feed of NFTs.
Yep.
And there was sort of like a light bulb moment when I was on this call with this DAO where it was like, well, we have built this. Like, this is what we have. We built this for our own social network, but this can be used outside of that. And so we didn't immediately pivot there, but I did start taking steps to make it so they could start using that backend. That is essentially a layer 2 on top of Arweave.
Okay.
And we were still building the social, but over the course of the next like 6 weeks, I think maybe 7 weeks, we had a lot of people coming to us and trying to use our database, and nobody was coming and trying to use our social. And so it was like, all right, well, we sort of accidentally found this problem of, there are no great ways to store and query structured data in Web3. And so, this was maybe 12 or 13 months ago, but we made the decision to just fully pivot to being a database. And that is sort of a long-winded answer, but that's kind of how I found my way into this space and solving this problem.
No, and it's really like such an amazing story. And one of the reasons why I'm so enthralled with Web3 and blockchain tech overall is because it's the modular internet. And, it allows for solutions to be, independent of other parts of the pieces of the puzzle and intermixed. Arweave exists and they still exist, and they're going to have a great time existing and building whatever they do. But you're able to kind of, again, as a layer 2 or almost a middle layer, insert yourself and solve a problem. Now there's a lot of risks when you're kind of relying on one protocol versus the other. But the point that I made in my intro is this is technology that is prevalent in Web 1 and Web 2. Like, there's not a chance that you're going to go into a database and not be able to, keyword and tag and do all sorts of filtering and fluffing that you needed. But in Web 3, we're just like, did you see that? I put that on chain and it's there and it's done. And like, I'm done, and somebody else will figure out the rest of it later. So I love the concepts of you guys being really focused on problem solving, and not being so focused on like, it has to be this one vision. It's about the technology and the roadmap, more than it was kind of the like that initial theses and being able to pivot there. So congrats on that. What was kind of the crux, as you said, we're going to pivot and move over to this. And I'm sure your team was very vested in the original concept and idea. What was the feedback you got right off the bat?
Yeah. So, it was a little scary, right? It's always tough saying, okay, I know we've been working on this for the last 9 months, 10 months. We're just going to throw a lot of it away and focus on this other thing. But overall, the team really did get behind it. It wasn't a decision we made immediately. We made the decision because we were trying really hard to get people to use this social platform, and we really couldn't. And despite that, we had people waiting to use our database platform. And so, after 6 weeks of that, we were like, okay, the writing is really on the wall here. Like, we have struck a chord. We have found something. We would be very stupid to not pick up the ball and run with it here. And so overall, it wasn't too hard to get the team behind it. That is sort of the benefit of having a small team. At the time there was 3 of us full time and two other guys part time. And so it was really easy to sort of get everyone on the same page of, we should do this for this reason. And, everyone also saw the writing on the wall. And so it wasn't too hard.
So just go ahead and into the kind of elevator pitch from end to end. What your solution does, how it's implemented, and what the end results, are guaranteed to be or should be.
Sure. Yeah. So, our solution, it is a decentralized, structured data store. And so, if you think about ways that you can store data, there's this is definitely a little bit of a over abstraction, but
Okay.
you can store it in either like a structured or unstructured way. And so, an unstructured way, you can sort of think of this like a folder on your computer. You can make a folder. You can make a folder inside of that. You can store files in there, and that's great. And if you know where a file lives, you can go and retrieve it from there and get it back and read whatever data is in there. But in the case of what we're building, which is a relational database, data is stored in a table. You can sort of think of it like Excel. It's not used like Excel, but you can visualize it like an Excel spreadsheet where there's rows and there's columns. And what's really cool is that you can write. There's a language called SQL or SQL. You can write queries to search through that table or several tables in different ways to extract pieces of data that you're looking for and also filter out pieces of data that you're not looking for. And so, sort of why this is important in Web3 right now is because of the evolution that we've seen in the space really only over the last, I'd probably say 18 months. And so, if you go prior to 18 months ago, or maybe at this point, like 20, 21 months ago, Web3 was almost synonymous with DeFi. Almost every major application in Web3 was decentralized finance. And for that, you had smart contract platforms like Ethereum to be sort of the underpinning infrastructure. And that was great. And that was, not only was that great, I think that was necessary. You need financial infrastructure before you can really build a lot of other things. But in the last 18 to 21 months, we've seen Web3 grow beyond just DeFi into decentralized science, decentralized social, decentralized gaming, decentralized analytics. And so there are all these new verticals in the space, but traditional smart contract infrastructure is not enough to underpin them. And in particular, it's not enough to provide data infrastructure for data that they need to store and query. And so we sort of see ourselves coming into this new role where we have all these new verticals that are beginning to show up in the space, and we are providing critical infrastructure to underpin that.
And doing it so in a language that a lot of them understand.
Yes, yeah, exactly. We've been working in house to develop our own SQL-like language. We started with just SQL, and actually our live product right now, if you go and use that, it's Postgres SQL. Postgres is like a very popular database engine. It is Postgres SQL, but we've begun developing our own language in house. You can sort of think of it like Solidity. You could write a smart contract in JavaScript, but it's actually a lot harder than if you use Solidity, because Solidity, it's made specifically for writing smart contracts. And so as we've sort of taken the traditional relational databases and have expanded their functionality for the decentralized internet, we sort of found that traditional SQL doesn't quite do the job. And so we've begun building our own language so that we can encapsulate a lot of those functionalities and do it elegantly so that it's easy for developers to understand and implement.
Fabulous overview. And I think this is one of the biggest challenges that faces our asset class, which is that transition from Web 2 to Web 3. And it's not a linear path, because a lot of the infrastructure has to be torn down and rebuilt to actually get to a true Web 3 world. But we have to start bridging this gap. We have to have the database engineers that are behind these, the CIOs behind the Fortune 1000 companies that go, we're testing, we're integrating, we're playing with this, because the one thing that's never going to happen, at least in my lifetime, is that you're going to see all these companies take their massive ERPs, their CRMs that have taken a decade to build, integrate, and throw those away and just say, we're moving 100% to a blockchain world. So integration and kind of familiarity with systems that they already have built in place, they're bulletproof, they're rock solid, and they've made their investments into there, both from an OpEx, CapEx, as well as kind of that institutional knowledge standpoint. Like, this is that layer to start transitioning people and saying, you know what, cool. How about instead of storing, your logos and everything else over on S3, let's just start getting a few things over here. What's been some of the more kind of, I think, unique use cases you've seen kind of flying through your forums and database and communities.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I think to sort of give like an overview of why you would want a decentralized database, it's for permissionless data rights and
Mm-hmm.
data composability, which is you as a developer, you can deploy the rules for a game, or in this case, it's a structured data store, and you can define who's able to write to it, how they're able to write to it, when they're able to write to it. You're able to deploy that, and that now works very similar to a smart contract. You don't have to be running the infrastructure for this. It just sort of exists forever. And so in that way, a decentralized database, it sort of acts as a smart contract for data and for complex data, where a lot of different parties that don't trust each other can converge and use the same data set and be writing and reading from the same data set, and also be sure that other parties that they don't trust are playing by the same rules. And so along those lines, we have seen a couple of very interesting use cases of this. So I think like a very basic one that, regardless of technical knowledge, that I think people would understand is decentralized social.
Mm-hmm.
So just, anything from storing basic, follower relationships to interest graphs. Are you interested in blockchain? Are you interested in baseball? Are you interested in, FIFA? And being able to store those for different people and then do analytics on those, such as curate a token airdrop based on a group of wallets' interest graphs. So that way, when you're airdropping your token, you're airdropping it to wallets that are more likely to interact with the genre or the type of project that you are building. So those have been like some of the more like I would say like ones that are don't require too much like technical deep diving. There's some really cool analytics projects as well. And then another vertical that I'd like to talk about for a sec is decentralized science.
Mm-hmm.
This is one that I think just it is very ripe for disruption. If you it really comes down to it's called the replication crisis, and it's particularly prevalent in psychological studies or psychological research, where a lot of major studies, and these are studies that were done decades ago, they didn't ever end up getting replicated or meaningfully replicated. And a lot of these studies are the basis for a lot of public policy that impacts our daily lives. And we're only finding out now, decades later, that these studies, they might have actually not been conclusive at all, because they have not been able to be replicated. And the reason that these studies have not been replicated is because the incentives around research funding are not there for replicating studies. It's only for new research and trying to push the needle forward instead of proving what we have found previously. And so there are a lot of really cool decentralized science projects that are looking to solve the replication crisis by altering the financial incentives for research. And that gives us better and more reliable research. And so that is another vertical that I'm particularly excited about.
I love that one. And you're the first person that's talked at length about decentralized science. We talk about social all the time, but you bring up the point that, yeah, you can. The monetization aspect of this is that you can poke holes in scientific papers with the same level of efficiency that bug hunters have with traditional tech platforms today. That there's rewards can live out there. The scientists or educators can see what these are, read the paper, and say, what, let me try to make that happen, and posting the results automatically get rewarded or validated, and that's what DAOs are designed for. You've researched enough of these. Who's doing it today that you think is kind of leading the way right now?
Like particularly in decentralized science.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So let's see. I want to be careful what projects I mention here because a lot of them are either still in stealth or they're going through. A lot of them are in incubators. Let's see. I'm trying to.
How about no names and just give overviews of what they're working on.
Perfect. That's a lot better. Okay. So there is. I guess there's two I can speak on. And so I guess the first one, they are focusing particularly on psychological studies. And their whole goal is it's essentially creating a betting market around the validity of studies. So, let's say you are the author of a study and you're the first person to do this type of research. And so you publish that, and then you say, you believe your results are correct. And so you say, I'm going to bet, 1,000 tokens that my results are correct. I did this correctly. I believe in my research, and so I'm going to bet 1,000 tokens. And then people who funded your study, your backers or your colleagues, they can also say, yeah, I believe that study is accurate, and I'm going to back that as well. And then there might be, other people that come along, other researchers that say, well, I see some issues with your study, and so I'm going to bet against that. And so now there is a financial incentive for them to prove you wrong. And other people can come in and place bets on this, saying, I believe this is correct, I believe this is not correct. And if they can eventually prove you wrong, or if more people continually prove you right, you then stand to gain more money from this system. And so that is one of the projects that's building that is really cool. The second one, it's a stem cell research project. This one, I know I can't talk about their. I want to be careful what I release, because they're in an incubator right now. It's a very, very prestigious incubator.
That's awesome.
I want to be careful about what I say here. But it's incentivized sharing of stem cell research data. So it uses zero knowledge proofs to sort of anonymize or pseudonymize the origin of stem cell data. But then it incentivizes sharing of that data. Right now, to get a stem cell match, it can cost inordinate amounts of money. And they think that they can get that down to be about $40 or $50 per match. And that money, instead of going to some research institution that's bringing people together, it's going to the person who is providing the actual stem cells. And so that is the other project that I'm particularly excited about.
That's awesome. So you mentioned ZK proofs and ZK rollups, and we're intimately familiar with the technology. How thorough do you think that level of kind of like, hey, here's all the information, but you got to trust us that it's all correct? How well do you think that works in a scientific field?
Yeah, I mean, in the scientific field, it's tough because I mean, for one, I'm going to preface this: I'm not a scientist, so this is definitely a little outside of my realm of expertise. But that's an interesting question. I don't know if there's ever been an alternative. I don't know if there's ever been the scientific data we have right now. It's the most we've ever been able to trust it. There isn't much more validity we can do right now. Without revealing like an entire scientific study. And so where ZK proofs are very interesting, and I'll also say this: I'm not a ZK proof expert. I really reside in sort of like the data storage and sorting algorithms domain. I think what's particularly interesting is that you can prove the validity of things. You can prove whether something exists, whether it does not exist, whether you took an action without actually revealing what that is. And so on the one hand, you get to still maintain intellectual property, and you still get to ensure that what you produce, the data you produced, is still yours, and you can control who sees it. But at the same time, people can also be sure that that data is valid, that you didn't cut any corners. And so it sort of removes the need for trust when you can cryptographically verify certain parts of truth. Now, I might have said some things that are slightly incorrect there. Once again, not a researcher. I'm not a ZK expert. I only work with them. And so,
yeah, no. And you're really, really close. So I'm not going to correct you on anything, because, the reality is that by the time this airs, the technology is going to shift. So, it's rapidly evolving. I think more so than anything else, you're bringing up a very good point, is that I say it all the time when people say, why are you in Web3? I said, because it's the most dynamic thing to happen to the planet since the first modem that dialed in and communicated digitally. Like, this isn't an evolution of Web2. This is great. We've figured out how to read and write on the web. We've got an entire different infrastructure now of validated, verified ownership of data and the validity of data, whether it's for the scientific community, whether it's for ownership of homes, cars, or whatever the case is. And so we really, really, really need at this juncture to get this right. And so something like ZK, I entirely endorse. I think it's a fabulous technology. It's still missing the nuances of that audit. It's still missing that you have to trust that the people that put it in there and that the reasons why it went in were valid in there. So it's still missing to me that audit function. Trust, but verify, and we can verify, but only to a certain level. And so I'm really excited, when we're thinking about the things that you're working on, when we're thinking about all these things in the scientific community, we have so much ability to start taking all these assets around the world, and all these papers and all these books, and just saying, we're done with paper. We as a society no longer need to kill a tree so that we can scribble information on it like it's 1,000 years ago. And so I think that, one of the things I'm getting out of the conversation with you is you really trying to help bridge that gap, as well as being forward thinking about the core infrastructure of online storage, which is not great today. It's not. I'm not knocking on Arweave or Filecoin or any of these guys. We don't use it, not because we can't query it, but because it's too slow and no one's willing to wait 30 seconds for an image or one of our little swimmy whales behind us to load. So, I mean, we're evolving there. What do you think the biggest challenge, right now facing Web3 is?
That's interesting. I think you could ask 10 people that and you're going to get 11 answers.
That's why I'm asking you. I've asked everyone else today.
Yeah. I think the biggest issue, this is something that we are intimately concerned about, but I think everyone or most people in Web3 are very interested in solving or improving, is Byzantine consensus. So how much data can you come to consensus on in a network, like denominated in bytes or kilobytes or megabytes, or just some measure of size of data? How much data can you come to consensus on per second securely? The biggest limiting bottlenecks in Ethereum, for example, it is how much data can be piped through that network. And we have modular blockchains like Cosmos, and then you have projects like Celestia trying to really standardize this process. But I don't think anyone's really done it right yet. And the reason I say that is because I've tried a lot of these solutions, and there just hasn't really been anything that has done it for Kwil yet. But so I think that the biggest limiting issue of blockchains right now is the amount of data you can come to consensus on in some period of time.
Yeah, I mean, we have the speed. Like, we know we can move things around the globe plenty fast. We know that we can store almost infinite amounts of data. It just becomes, how do you make it work in that blockchain world? So I love the concept of, we got to get more data up there. We have to be able to validate and verify it a lot faster. You're a DeFi guy, you're a degen guy. Do you think that a public blockchain, like Ethereum or Cosmos or all the ones that you're working on today, do you think that problem solved, from a true decentralized manner, or is it going to take something like a private chain to potentially where they control the nodes, they control, the information? It's very S3 sounding. So again, the degens always yell at me about this, but I like to have the concepts because there's a couple different things happening. Number one, there's a reason for a public blockchain, and they're fabulous and they're going to exist forever. But the core concept between a private blockchain is you have to solve a singular problem. You have to solve it very, very well, and it has to be perfect. You don't get an opportunity for error to say, well, it's an emerging technology. Do you feel like there's a world in here for both public and private chains, or what's your thoughts?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think I want to be careful on how deep I go on this, because some of it, might be releasing a little too much alpha, but I think it's a spectrum. This is not a hot take, but I think it's maybe somewhat unpopular. Decentralization is generally bad, and what I mean by bad is it's slower, it's more expensive, it's less efficient, it uses more energy, and I don't think that will ever change. I think centralization will always be more efficient, simply because decentralization, you do a lot of the same things, but with extra steps. And so I think it'll be a spectrum. There is a level of decentralization necessary, for different applications. Let's take Bitcoin, for example. It's trying to be, the world's new currency. I think that needs to be as decentralized as possible. I think that's something that you want that to be on the spectrum, the most level of decentralized. But then, let's take I'm not going to use the stem cell research startup that I talked about, because they're doing some different things with data privacy. But let's take like a healthcare provider, and they want to provide ease of transfer and access for healthcare data. Well, healthcare data is very sensitive, and you will never be able to get the data security that you can get on a centralized on-premise server on a decentralized network. And so they would probably be looking for something a bit more on the other side of the spectrum, where they're still looking to have a lot of the interoperability and composability provided by blockchains, but they also have to be very careful with who's able to access it, who's able to write data, who's able to read data. And so I think, as this space emerges, we're not going to see, there's Web 2 and there's Web 3 and there's nothing in between. I think it's going to generally be a spectrum where, depending on what an application needs and what aspects of permissioned technologies it's trying to relax, it will become some level of decentralized. But I don't think it's so black or white. I think it's a little more gray.
Yeah, and I love your answer. And we've spent so much time with like Burst IQ, which is a chain specifically designed for the healthcare industry, and they have the ability. You're already looking it up. And so Burst IQ has done an amazing job because they obfuscate the fields. So you can write data. You have to have the key to be able to expose it because you can't have all your healthcare data just floating around out there. But the other thing is because they're a private chain, they can go to the individual states and say, what do you need to be compliant here, because we want to be compliant, we don't want anyone in trouble. And certain states, certain countries say decentralized, this is fine, it can't leave our borders. So you can only this data can only be housed on nodes that are within our country or our state or whatever the case is. And does that mean it's not decentralized because we're compliant? That's an argument I'm sure a lot of people would say. You could say no, it needs to be fully decentralized and anyone should be able to store that data. Well, then it's not going on chain for any foreseeable future, and that technology will kind of die in the vine. On the flip side, I think it is really, to me, the biggest challenges is that this will be a world of many chains, thousands of them, individual chains, public chains, private chains, special interest chains, and everything else. So I really get into and that's why I like what you guys are doing. I think our two biggest problems right now are bridges and wallets. I think no one's even come close to solving the bridge problem, and the wallet problem is so far from anything that even looks like it's usable. And that's what it's going to take to be able to say the technology that you're building today with Kwil, like it's all still out there. It's all still free flowing. It requires you to go hunt and look for it. Versus, what we're used to today, which is you open a website and it just displays it for you, and if you integrate from other sites, your email doesn't care, what server it's hosted on, whether it's S3 or Azure, it just displays an image the same as your browser does.
Yeah, exactly. And I think we there's a lot of steps that need to be taken to get there, and I think we're still several years out. But I think it'll be gradual. We're starting to see. Actually, last year we saw a lot of bridges get hacked for a lot of money, but I think these things get better over time. It's a very nascent technology, and so right now a lot of trying to find the best way to phrase this. I'm trying to not get too deep and to
Go for
provide.
it. You can't hurt. You can never go too deep with us. We're majority
Cool.
degens, but I'll simplify it for you afterwards.
Awesome. So yeah, earlier I talked about how much data you can come to consensus on. The amount of bytes per second you can come to consensus on for a single network, and essentially using that in a strongly consistent system, or an eventually consistent system that is relatively quick. We want consistency fairly quickly. Nobody has really figured out a secure way to do that in a Byzantine context. There are a lot of people claiming they have, but a lot of people that have claimed they have seem to get hacked, and so there's certainly nothing I trust yet, and I don't think I personally have the time to go through and individually verify whether each solution is accurate. But at some point, I do think there will be a standard for these things, and we're already starting to see this emerge. In Cosmos, for example, we have the IBC. I know Chainlink as well; they're working on CCIP. And so there are a lot of major players in the space really working to solve this issue where we can securely bridge from one chain to another. It's not going to be as much of a closed off ecosystems where it's hard to transfer between them. It's going to be much easier to go from a fully decentralized blockchain like Bitcoin, or something like Ethereum, where it's still very decentralized, and then maybe going all the way to an on-premise, or I guess not an on-premise blockchain doesn't make sense, but a blockchain where nodes are hosted within borders of a certain country, and it'll be relatively easy to transfer back and forth on those. I think at this point there is enough warrant for that technology to exist that it will happen. The upside for somebody figuring that out and doing it securely is so massive that I believe it's probably inevitable. We might still be a few years out, or maybe more than a few years out, but I do think it will be inevitable that we have that.
Kwil, it's been amazing to hear, kind of what you've been working on with Kwil. And, Brennan, what I really like is that you guys are all developers, so everyone in your company is a coder. They understand that language. And I think in a startup, you have to have that common language. And whether it's business, whether it's, vision, or whether it's code, you have to have that, like, we all understand where it's going, because you as a CEO, like, here's where I want to go. And they all need to understand that this is what you're doing and where you're going, because they all understand that commonality. Where do you kind of see the Web3 asset class going? You're relatively new to the space, but you've gone through the bull, you've gone through the bust, and now we're waiting for the next bull. What's kind of got you focused right now on where that's going to be?
Yeah. So I guess I will preface this with a couple things. So one, I don't own much like cryptocurrency personally. Like I'm not really much of a trader. I don't own NFTs. Part of that is because I just dropped out of college. I don't really have a ton of money. But yeah, so especially on like the NFT side, I don't think I have any particularly interesting insights there. But one thing that I do think will be a defining factor in different assets in Web3 will be block space. And I think unfortunately, I don't have any specific specific like resources or materials or podcasts that he's been on, but someone who talks about this a lot is Chris Dixon from Andrews Horowitz. A great product to be selling in Web3 is block space. And this sort of comes back to a lot of what we've talked about before. How much data can you come to consensus on? The reason why Ethereum, for example, the reason why it's generating so much protocol revenue is because there is such a high premium on block space. People want to be buying that block space. And so I think the projects that are driving demand in who wants to buy their block space, those are going to be the ones that appreciate in value. In this last bull run, to be fair, I don't pay a lot of attention to prices or really much at all. But when I would look at prices, I never really noticed much of a correlation between a network's revenue, essentially in most cases tokens burned, versus emissions and then token price. It seemed to be a bit more speculative and not super correlated, but I don't think it will always be that way. I think at some point, at the end of the day, this Web3 protocols, they are a business that is trying to make revenue, and that revenue is who is willing to pay the most for block space in these applications and in these networks. And so if I were an investor and I was looking for the protocols or the token that I would be buying into next, I would probably be looking for where are people going to want to be building, because the value of building on the same chain, this is the reason why Ethereum block space is so high. One is the security of knowing that chain is robust, but two is being able to compose with other applications, importing, application business logic and the state of that application directly into your application and using it with, no modifications necessary, or you can't even modify it if you wanted to. And so if I were going to be buying tokens right now, I would be looking what chains are building the most valuable applications that people are going to be wanting to write data to in the future, or that people are going to be wanting to build applications that then write to those other applications. So yeah, I would be looking at the use cases and where are the most interesting projects being built on top of a network.
And I think that's really interesting because you're talking about, layer zeros, layer ones, layer twos and everything else. The core concept is not a Doge. It's not a something that through sprinkle a little blockchain pixie dust on it and your hopes and dreams and the price is going to rise. It has real utility and actual real world value. And I think that's an incredible distinction that we don't always hear. You're not a trader, but you automatically have a thesis because that's what you work in and that's what you see the value in. So I love that perspective and insight. Brennan, if people want to know more about you or Kwil, how can they find you guys?
Yeah, so I think the best would probably be Twitter. So it's just at Kwil Team on Twitter, just KWIL Team. You can also find us on our website, kwil.com, just kwil.com. You can find me on Twitter, Brennan_Lamey is my handle, or you can email me, brennan@kwil.com. I would probably say I'm probably the most responsive on Telegram or email. So my Telegram is just at Kwil Brennan, or Brennan@kwil.com are probably the two best ways to reach me. I don't check my Twitter DMs too often. I'm trying to get better at it. But yeah, those are probably the best ways.
If you get bored, can you just solve that problem, please? I am so tired of having 20 different social things of which I'm never checking. My apps are always going. So if blockchain can do one thing, and that's bring all these social networks into one unified inbox, we'll all be very happy and you'll be very successful. So love it, dude.
Yeah. Thank you
Fabulous.
so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Anytime. yWhales, this is Brennan and Kwil. We'll see another just really amazing young entrepreneur entering the space. And I think we're going to be seeing a lot from you over the years. I'm excited to see kind of how you personally grow and evolve as well as Kwil and the developer focused team that you guys have. With that being said, yWhales, we'll see you next time, guys.
Thank you.